And go ahead.
My grandfather on my father's side came to this country in 1870. He left my grandmother in Europe, pregnant with my oldest aunt, Ida, who, after he came here with his mother, he was an only child, and he was 19 years old, and he married my grandmother, who was about 7 years his senior. He came here.
And what was her name?
Her name, my grandmother's name was Sarah Malinsky. And when my father came to this country, they said to him, what kind of an American name is Malinsky? Change it to a good German name like Goldstein. We changed the name to Goldstein. And 6 months later, he brought his wife over, and my aunt Ida was born in this country. And subsequently, he kept my grandmother pregnant 11 times, and out of the 11 times, she had 9 children living. She had 5 boys and 4 girls. My oldest aunt was Aunt Ida, who died in her late 90s. And then came my Uncle Jack, Paul, Louis, my father, Herman, and Barney. And then there was my aunt Ida, Annie, Leah, Betsy, and
that's 4.
4. I guess that's 4. Of course, my father was an extremely lazy individual. All he knew was to keep my grandmother pregnant most of the time, and he was never interested in working. He had himself a horse and a wagon. He was theoretically a moving man, but when he had a moving job, he'd give it to somebody else to do it. He owned the horse and wagon, and he'd get a small commission. He didn't believe in working, not that he was a religious man. He was just lazy. His mother worked until she died to help support him. He was an only son. He was the apple of her eye. Anyhow, my father slept on the floor as long as he lived at home, because there were so many in the house, and they had about 3-room apartment with the bathrooms down on the Lower East Side, down on in the yard, in the back part of the house. And when he was 13 years old, his father said, if you want to eat a decent meal, you better go out and work. So when he was about in the 5th grade, he knew how to read and write. And his first job was a job as a errand boy for a photographer for $3 a week. Freezing his pants off in all kinds of weather and delivering for this photographer. He made up his mind he was going to be a photographer, and of course, subsequently, he became a photographer, and he made a living all his life as a photographer. That's his beginning. But my mother, of course, came to this country in 1905 from Lithuania, where my grandfather and grandmother on my father's side came to this country. I believe it was someplace in Poland, near the German border. That's what I heard. And the reason why he came here, then there was always turmoil, and he was an only son. He was afraid he was going to be drafted into the army, so he took off. And he came here, of course, naturally at the time. There was a tremendous amount of opportunity. The country was really growing. But
yeah, the 1870s is very early to have come.
1870 he came here.
Right after the Civil War.
Came right for 5 years after the Civil War.
What was his name?
His name was Morris.
Morris.
Moses Morris. Grandmother's name was Zlata. which is Charlotte.
Oh, wow.
And he, my grandmother, my mother came here in 1905. The reason she came here in 1905, they were already stirring about a revolution in Russia, and and there were a bunch of young radicals coming from a small town. She came from a small town in Lithuania called Kovna Gubernia, which is the state of Kovna, and the town was mixed. It was very small, and our father became very nervous, and he brought her. He had her come over. He sent a letter to her brother Sam, who was 14 years her senior. When she was born, her father was 70 years old. That was his second wife. His first wife had died. And practically all her nieces and nephews were some of 25 years older than she was. She had a sister who lived in Asbury Park, a half sister, who was old enough to be her mother. So her mother.
How old was she when she came in 1905?
She was 16 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
Her father was 86.
Wow.
She wasn't here very long before he passed away. She was the apple of his eye. Mm-hmm. Her brother Sam came here 14 years older than she was. So when he came to this country when he was about 18, and so and she was about 4 years old, I guess. So she never really knew him. She only knew him from a picture that they got from him. And he was also very prolific as far as he was very religious, and he ended up having 12 children. Anyway, he was married to my father's second oldest sister, Leah, and they were living together. They had a double-decker house in Brownsville, and Sam sent. My grandfather was afraid, so he sent a letter to Sam telling him to send money to bring my mother to this country. Now you can imagine what prices were at that particular time, the cost of travel. She $35 would cost to send. She didn't go steerage, one step above steerage. She came to this country, and he sent them and asked for $35. Sam at that time already had 4 or 5 children. He kept his wife pregnant for 20 years. As I said, he had 12 children. They were about 18 months apart, every one of them. So he kept his wife pregnant for 20 years. Anyhow, when she came to this country, he already had about 5 kids. So what he did was, he went to Asbury Park. Asbury Park, where her oldest sister lived, her name was Myrtle. But Myrtle's children, who were 25 years my mother's senior, don't forget, my mother was born, her mother had a change-of-life baby. She was about 46 years old when my mother was born. So, and they were already very prosperous. They had a tremendous furniture store, and they were in business there. They had money, and he went to Asbury Park, and he asked them to have $35 to send to Europe to bring my mother to this country. She landed in Ellis Island, and my Uncle Sam knew enough to give a little bribe to the custom inspector, so she didn't have to stay there too long. There was a big crowd. She got a little bit of a Zinka, a little suitcase that she carried with her. She ran, and he got it, and he met her, and she got through customs, and she came to this country got into the IRT, the IRT had just been built, and he took her out to Brownsville. And then when she got out there, my Uncle Louis, who was 2 years older than my father, said to my father, who was living they shared this two-family house in Brownsville. They came up in the world. They moved. After all, they moved from the Lower East Side to Brownsville,
oh, yeah.
which was considered a step up. And Louis said to my father, "Your brother-in-law Sam brought you a bride. Mother was a gorgeous woman, I must say. Because he took a picture of her when she was 16 and a half. We have it in an album upstairs. And of course, it was really, what you say, it was love at first sight. And of course, they got married in 1909. My mother was 21.
Oh, so they courted a long time then.
Yes. And she learned, she went to night school. She learned to speak English. She learned to read. She never learned to write. She learned how to read. She was able to read. She was able to sign her name, and she was able to. And she spoke with an accent.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question about it. But she went to night school, and while she was in Europe as a kid, she learned how to be a dressmaker. So she got a job as a dressmaker as soon as she came here. And for a short time, she lived with her brother Sam. And then my Aunt Leah, who was overburdened with children, like one after another, tried to use my mother as a maid. And my father, who was already getting courting her,
mm-hmm.
was very resentful of that and told her that you didn't come to this country to be a maid. And she told her brother that I didn't come here to be a maid. And she moved out. She lived on her own, and she worked as a dressmaker.
Did she live in her own apartment, or was she a boarder?
She was a boarder. She didn't have an apartment. She was a boarder.
Did she ever tell you what her journey was like coming to this country? Did she catch a boat from Poland, or did she
took a train from the capital of Lithuania, which I don't know what it was.
Is it Riga?
Riga, I guess it was. And from Riga, she took a train from Riga to Brussels.
Mm.
And from Brussels, she got on to a boat. I forget the name. I think she came on to Mauritania.
Mm-hmm.
And from Mauritania, they stopped in Liverpool. And from Liverpool, she came to Ellis Island.
Oh, okay, because I was wondering about that.
She was picked up at Ellis Island.
You said that.
And as I said, she took her over to Brownsville. Then of course, they courted and they got married in 1909. And of course, they stayed married until they were almost 65 years. They were almost married. And of course, in my immediate family, my brother Ed was born in 1910.
Can we go back for a second? When your dad learned his trade, there's a famous story, I believe, about didn't he leave New York for a while to learn his trade?
What happened was, he did everything in photography. He was a portrait photographer. He worked as a copy photographer, where he made copies and people used to airbrush him. Before he got married, he learned a little bit about photo engraving. He knew his photography cold, but he learned a little bit about photo engraving, where they etched the plate, and then that plate was used in the printing. And he didn't know that in Milwaukee at the time they were trying to break the union, and he came in he didn't realize it at the time. Pardon me, but he was practically a scab labor. came in there, and he really didn't know too much about it, but he understood his photography, and when he did the work, he would do it, and he would say to them, fortunately, when he did, it turned out fine. A few times he said, "This is the way we do it back east. How do you do it here?" So by manipulation, he learned how to be a photo engraver. But he was terribly homesick because he was very much in love with my mother.
Oh, so he did it well
Before he got married.
But Emily was courting Ethel.
He was about 20, 21 years old. And at that time, a lot of them developed lung problems because they had to work over it with nitric acid to make the plates, photo engravings. So he quit the job, even though he was making, at that time he was making big money. They were paying him $35 a week. And he was very reliable, and he used to work the night shift.
So he just heard there was work in Milwaukee, so he went? Is that what happened?
He went there. There was work. He found out, I guess he saw he had a newspaper, New York newspaper, that he was working with. So he took a short course in photo engraving. He knew his photography,
Mm-hmm.
and they used to plate the metal, and they used to photograph on the plate, and they used to photograph through a screen.
Mm-hmm.
It was a whole process. At one time, Barbara made a tape with his experience in Milwaukee. I don't know whether he came to that tape. Anyhow, they got married in 1909. And Eddie, of course, was the firstborn. And of course, he was my mother's favorite because he was named for her father. And her father's name was Naftali. And she called him Nettie. She didn't call him Nettie. She called him Nettie. And when she went to register him in school, they said, "What kind of a name is Nettie?" So they said, "It's probably Edward." So they gave him the name Edward. But so he was the only one, except for me, who had a middle name.
Right, because his first name was really...
His first name should have been Nathan.
Right.
Because some of my Uncle Sam's children, one of them was named Nathan after his father, Nathaniel.
Mm-hmm.
So he would have been his English name. Naftali was his Hebrew name. Of course, then Eddie was born, and then within less than 2 years, Henry was born. Henry was born in 1912, and then in 1913, Teddy was born. 1918, Jimmy was born. And of course, when they moved in, they left Brownsville because they were living in all four children were born in Brownsville. My father bought a house in Brownsville. He was doing very well as a photographer, and finally he had his own business. And they moved out of Brownsville, and they bought this house in Borough Park, which in 1919, an attached house, which they paid $4,500 for. Two-family, two-story house. And today they would call it a townhouse. It was 8 houses attached, and so it was a townhouse. And I, of course, was a product of the new house. Purely accidental, I'm sure. At 1920, I was born. And as a kid growing up in Borough Park, which was a very safe neighborhood, it was a sort of a middle class neighborhood. Of course, I grew up in 1926. was 6 years old, of course, you've heard the story from my grandma many times. I developed a ruptured appendix, and they figured I was finished. And so I can remember this today. All day long I was screaming and crying with cramps, and then my mother finally called the doctor. I was running the temperature, and he walked right in. He said, "This boy has an appendicitis, and it may be rupturing." And I couldn't understand why my mother started to cry like a baby. I could just picture her sitting in the corner crying, because she figured that was the end, because it was absolutely fatal. There was no antibiotics. And most people who developed a ruptured appendix died because they developed a peritonitis. The peritoneum is the part of your body that keeps all your organs in place. It's connective tissue. And when that becomes infected, as a result of the appendix rupturing and all this feces and everything getting into your bowel, it was fatal. Anyhow, I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and they kept on shooting me full of adrenaline to keep my heart beating. Yeah. So they were using those things. And at the time, my pulse was about 6 and my temperature was close to 107. And they figured that I was finished. Blood transfusions were very, very rare. It was practically a new thing, blood transfusions. So the doctor said, "I don't think he's going to make it." So they said, so my father said, "Why don't you try, we have nothing to lose, why don't you try giving him a blood transfusion?" And at that time, wasn't like it is today. Blood wasn't given to you. It was a direct transfusion.
Oh, wow.
My mother had the same blood type I had, and they called this man out in the middle of the night. This doctor who specialized in blood transfusion, she lied down next to me, and she gave me a pint of blood. And they had tubes in my stomach. That's why we always think they had a double belly button. That is what is known as an incisional hernia.
Mm.
It's a soft wall.
Mm-hmm.
And I should have had it repaired many years ago. And for months, they had tubes in there, and it was draining pus.
And where did the transfusion come into, though? Like
My arm.
into your arm. And somewhere in that time period too was when you did get your middle name, right?
What happened was, my Uncle Sam was a very religious man. That's why all my cousins, my cousins were double cousins, because my father's sister, Leah, was married to my mother's brother, Sam.
Right.
So they were my double cousins. So he was religious, and he said, "We ought to give him a middle name." That was a custom. Maybe that'll. It's a superstition. If you give a middle name, when the angel of death comes around to pick scare. Sounds funny.
No, it's a great story.
It scare him off.
Oh, I thought it was he'd trick him because you would be a different person, because instead of being Percy Goldstein, you'd be Percy Zachary Goldstein.
So Zachary my Aunt Ida was the original hypochondriac, and she looked over 90. But that's not the point. She had a terrific sense of humor, but she was a miserable individual. And her first husband, because she was so miserable, she also had quite a few children. Because she was so miserable, he took the drink. And a few times he actually beat her up. I mean, she probably deserved it. Anyhow. So my father got very, very mad. He had a fight with him because he beat up his older sister. And my father beat him up. Literally. subsequently, the guy was killed by, he was hit with a horse and wagon. In those days they had horse and
Yeah.
wagons. When I grew up, the peddlers used to come around and they used to wash the streets periodically because of the horsemen who were on the street for still had horse and buggies. Thank you, sir. And anyhow.
This relates to Zachary, though.
So that's why my father, knowing his sister, he felt sorry for the fact that he wanted to beat this man up and that he was killed.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave me his name.
Ah.
Zachary actually means blessed by God. You know, the Hebrew is Zerach.
Mm-hmm.
Zerach. Zachary was somebody in the Bible who was somehow blessed. Anyhow, so that's how they got the name Zachary. And of course, lately it's become a very popular name.
So, when they did the blood transfusion, how had you been in the hospital a long time already, or
I've been in the hospital 3 weeks.
when they did the blood transfusion?
I don't know when they did the transfusion. I stayed in the hospital. When they finally took me home, the wound was still being dressed.
Yeah, that's what you're saying.
It stopped draining, but it was, my mother kept on redressing the wound. And she took me we went up to the Catskill Mountains, and I remember while we were up there, she was treating it, it closed up, the wound cleared up. The doctor used to call me his miracle. That's right. But they never ever expected me to survive that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was really delirious. No, it was quite an episode. I got your mother, I heard it 1,000 times from my mother. So
I did too, but I never realized that
It was-
blood transfusions were so rare at that time. So to me, when she was always saying that, I never really understood the
not only that, they had absolutely no way of. There wasn't such a thing as sulfur. There wasn't any sort of an antibacterial or anti-infection type of a medication. Because penicillin wasn't developed developed by Alexander Fleming during the time of the Second World War, in the early 40s. And in 1937, they first came out with sulfur, which was practically the panacea for pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
Pneumonia was deadly. Every year, during the winter months, they used to have a long list of casualties, people who died of pneumonia. Because pneumonia, when somebody had pneumonia, it was just like, it was in many cases, it was fatal.
It was a death sentence.
It was a death sentence. It was almost like tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, when I managed to survive that, of course, and
Did it happen in the summer, or did you miss a lot of school, or you don't remember?
I missed school, and I missed a lot of school because I was out of school in my first grade, and I had to repeat the first grade, and I was a slow learner, and as a result, I remember going to summer school one year to make up the grade, so that I would graduate on time.
Mm-hmm.
But growing up in Borough Park was even though the depression years, my father was very fortunate. He always made a living, even during the height of the depression. He had some good accounts. He was only 2 blocks away from John Wanamaker, and he used to do all their advertising department. He used to make blow-ups for at each one of their entrances. They used to have a blow-up of their daily sales. So he used to deliver 30 by 40 days a week to join winemakers.
So did he mostly do commercial photography, or
So
what?
he did
Oh,
commercial.
wow, okay.
He didn't do any corporate photography. He did commercial photography. He made photo murals, all types of blow-ups. And during the World's Fair in 1936, there was a fellow named Frank Buck who used to go to Africa and bring back wild animals. Frank Buck, bring them back alive, was a slogan. And we had a big exhibit at the World's Fair. And I remember my dad making these big photo murals of the animals and pasting them up on the wall. We went there, and he and Reuben and some of his helpers hung them up like wallpaper. These tremendous photo murals. And he worked with some of the department stores. And then at that particular time, even during the Depression years, there were agents that used to go around, and you had a photograph of one of your members of your family, your father, or son, or somebody. He would make a copy of that, and then they would go to an airbrush artist, and they would paint them the clothes and everything else, and then they would frame them. They were 1620s, 20 by 40, 20 by 24. These big frames, these big pictures were very popular. And he had a slew of, they didn't work, they were all independent operators. They used to bring him the prints, the photographs, and he used to copy them and blow them up. Some of them used to mount on cardboard, and some of them used to emboss them, so that, they were in order to emboss pictures like. And as I say, we always had, it wasn't, we never had the kind of a situation that Mother grew up in. We had a comfortable home, even though we only had a bathroom upstairs and the bed and the toilet in the basement, and it was a modern bathroom, so it was a heated house, and as I say, my father was very, very ambitious as far as making a living is concerned. He dabbled in the market. He lost money during the crash. And at that time, he lost about $30,000, which would probably be the equivalent of $200,000 today, if not more. But
really? So he lost that much in the market?
Yeah, he lost that much in the market. Then he went in. Then in order to try to recoup that, he went into business. He financed the business with my Uncle Barney, like my cousin Buddy's father. And Barney was my grandfather's favorite son because he was named for his mother. So Barney was catered to. And Barney was a very, very inventive man. He could take something apart and figure out something, and he had a tremendously inventive mind. Buddy is the same way. And so my father financed him, and to the tune of about $15,000, which was a lot of money. And they were making some beautiful, at that time, ashtrays, and they called perfume trays. They had all kinds of orders from some of the big jobbers, and Barney was fooling around with the women that worked there. He was lazy, never filled the orders. He used to get the orders and never filled them. So he really squandered my father's investment. Father was angry with him for years and years and years. Anyway, that was the story of my father. But of course, growing up in Borough Park was not like it is growing up in today. everybody in the neighborhood knew one another. We knew all our neighbors. We played out on the street. We would go in, we'd walk out at night. We'd drive the subways at night. Think nothing of it. Come home all hours of the night. It was never any frightening situation. And of course, as I grew up, I knew that things were pretty tough. But as I say, we never really suffered. But we always tried to make an extra buck. All my brothers, Jimmy, and I may say my brother Eddie played the violin, Henry played the drums, Jimmy learned to play the piano. My sister took piano lessons half a dozen times, but she was too lazy to practice. She always had a crush on the teacher, but she never practiced. Until my father finally got disgusted, and then Jimmy took up the piano. And at that time, it was to pay a dollar lesson. This was Depression. Things were very cheap. Even when I went to down school in 1941, they were sending me $11 a week. I paid $3 rent for a room, and it cost me less than $1 a day for food. I got along very well.
Mm-hmm.
I ate well.
Mm-hmm.
But that's another story. Anyhow, as I said, growing up in Borough Park, we used to be. It was a very pleasant time as I think back.
Do you have particular memories from either elementary school or junior high or like?
In elementary school, I was always in trouble in school. Mother was always coming up. He was always getting into a fight with somebody, and I wasn't. I remember getting slapped by a teacher a few times because I started to laugh and I became disruptive. I think back, as a kid until I was I would say about 10 years old. I would be considered hyperactive.
Mm.
I was. You think Sam is active. I was impossible. When I was about 7 years old, 8 years old, I remember they took me to Asbury Park. My mother used to go to Asbury Park very frequently to visit her. She was very close with the people in Asbury Park, and they loved her very dearly. And they always wanted her to come and visit. And as I said, they were very wealthy. They lived right near the beach, and we had a gorgeous home. And
so when you were young, what happened?
When I was young, I remember going there and going into one of the bedrooms and mixing up all the perfumes, and I was going through all the drugs. I was a heavy. I was terrible. I was impossible. Anyhow, I'm telling you, I wonder why they didn't kill me when I was growing up. They used to put the strap to me pretty frequently, but I it never had any effect on me as far as people talk about having been abused as a kid. My father used to slap me around with his belt, and I used to hide underneath the bed. Hide in the bathroom and anything.
They always found you.
And my brother Eddie, of course, being the oldest, used to order me around. And of course, Jimmy and I were very, very close. We couldn't be any closer. We did everything together growing up. The fact of the matter is, the reason I even went into dentistry was because of Jimmy. As a kid, we talked about becoming dentists when I was going to high school. And anyhow, so when I went to, of course, I went to junior high school. I remember one time at junior high school, I was a little rowdy on the stairs, and one of the teachers, I still remember his name was Mr. Hanlon. He said to me, "What's your name?" I said, "Percy Goldstein." He says, "You must be kidding me." Oh, whack! Slapped me across the face. And when I came home and I told it to my father, he was mad as hell. They sent my mother up to school and wanted to know why I was being slapped. And I thought the principal made all kinds of excuses. And that was that. I went to high school. When I was going to high school, I managed to have my program so that I started early and I finished about 12:30. And then I used to take lunch along with me. This was in my, actually the school was very, very crowded. And I went to junior high school. I went from the 7th grade to the 9th grade, which is the first year of high school. And then I went to an annex because the main building on 79th Street and 16th Avenue was too crowded. So I went to an annex for 1 year, which was on 18th Avenue and 48th Street. So I used to walk to school, and when I went to public school from 1st to 6th grade was 164, which was on 14th Avenue, 43rd Street. All my brothers went to that same school. We all went to 164, except Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy was sent to the yeshiva. They sent him to the yeshiva, and he was very, very unhappy there.
Hmm.
So after the 6th grade, they took him out of the yeshiva, and they sent him to, at that time they had Erasmus he went to Erasmus, and Erasmus also combined the junior high with the senior high. So he went from the 7th grade to finish high school, 12th grade at Erasmus.
Now, did you play sports in high school?
I ran. I was a runner. I was on a track team. I ran during the time of, what was his name again? I think his name is now Glenn Cunningham. Glenn Cunningham was an outstanding runner. He would have formed 4-minute mile. Glenn Cunningham. That time I was a miler. And when I went up to Boy Scout camp when I was 14 years old, I ran in what they called the white bar relay. I ran 4 miles, and then I passed the baton to somebody else, and it was a regular marathon. And then I beat one of the men who was running. It was a miler. It was one of the high schools, an outstanding miler. So when I went to Egypt, I was on track team. And I think I didn't break the 4-minute mile. I was doing a mile in a little over 4 minutes. So
4:10 or something like that?
about 14. I was very fast on the mile.
Was all that running from the teachers?
I was running. I was already running after the women.
Or running? Maybe you were running after the
But I would say that
playgrounds or
I completely changed when I reached about 10, 11 years old. I sort of settled down, and I became much more serious. And of course, growing, as I said, I had a lot of friends when I went to high school. I'm sorry that I didn't maintain a lot of that friendship after I went off to down school. But I was always very busy. As I mentioned before, I arranged my schedule in my junior and senior year in high school, where I used to go to New York, take the West End subway to my father's place, and started when I was about 16 until I graduated when I was 18. I wasn't like your mother. I didn't graduate at 17. I graduated at 18. And they almost had to bring the school around to get me out. So anyhow, I worked for my dad, and then when I graduated from high school, my grades weren't that great, and during the Depression years, there was no such thing as open enrollment. So I had to go to NYU because in order to get into Brooklyn College or into City College, you had to have close to a 90 average. And I didn't have anything really in that 90 average. I had somewhere between 75 and 80. Anyhow, so I went to NYU, and I went to NYU partially at night and partially during the day because my father was 2 blocks away from NYU. His business was on at two doors south of Astor Place. You know where Astor Place is?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was 736 Broadway, and NYU was just right up the street.
Mm-hmm.
So
Did Eddie and Henry and Jimmy go to Brooklyn College, or where'd they go to school?
Eddie went to Columbia.
Oh, that's right.
Eddie went to Columbia. Eddie started off at City College.
Mm-hmm.
But he figured City College, to get into medical school at that particular time, was extremely difficult to get to medical school. He had better than a B+ average at college. So he transferred from City College to Columbia. Because from the time he was going to high school, he knew he wanted to be a physician.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to Columbia, and at that time it was impossible. He thought that he was getting into Long Island Medical School. They said if you got a certain card, after you were going to get it, it was very difficult. This was 1932. And he was studying German because he thought he would go to Leipzig. If he couldn't get into American school, he was going to go to Leipzig, just before the rise of it.
Wow.
He got a notice from Long Island Medical School, which in most cases symbolized that you were going to be admitted.
Mm-hmm.
So then he got an interview from Bellevue, NYU, and he was very, very relaxed because he figured he was getting into Long Island Medical School. And sure enough, he was ready to go to Leipzig when he was admitted and got a notice that he was accepted in Bellevue.
Mm.
And he graduated from Bellevue in 1936.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
In his first year, he didn't go into a general internship. Those days you didn't go into residency like you do today. You had a 2-year rotating internship where you did everything.
Mm-hmm.
You rode the ambulance. You got $15 a month. That was the pay. $15 a month. Anyway, so his first year he worked as a pathologist. He had an internship as a pathologist up at Lincoln Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, he spent 2 years at Cumberland in a rotating internship. And he was in general practice. He was in general practice, I would say, for about 15 years or so. Then he studied for his boards, and he got his boards in ear, nose, and throat. And then that became his specialty.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in ear, nose, and throat for I'd say about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
30 years.
So you went to NYU because you couldn't go to.
And I was paying, it was cost $10 a credit.
Oh, $10 a credit.
It was very expensive.
Yeah, I was wondering what they cost.
$10 a credit. I went to NYU day and night.
Mm-hmm.
It was a real rough deal. The fact of the matter is, when I first got out of high school, I didn't know what I wanted to be. I wasn't sure. So I said, I'll try going being an accountant.
Mm.
So I went 1 year at night, and I was working in my father's place during the day. And they were paying me $10 a week. And I was going to City College at night on 23rd Street, and I found that awfully boring. I think I went one semester to City College at night. And that time, Buddy's brother, who was a traveling salesman, my cousin Marty, wanted somebody to photograph his samples. He made these 8x10 photographs of his samples. So he asked me to wait for him. He was going to pay me $15 a week. And at that time I was going. At the time I was going to City College at night. After that, one year I said, "Well, this is ridiculous. I think I'm going to go to NYU day and night, waste some amount of time with my father's place, and go and take some courses at night, some courses during the day, and get enough credits to get into dental school." So I applied to so I got enough credits to get into dental school. It was 1941. Jimmy had just graduated from dental school. He started dental school in 37 and graduated in 41. And I got into two schools. I was accepted in Pitt, and I was accepted in Temple. Just happened there was a few fellows that I knew that were going to Pitt that lived in Borough Park. They would tell me it's a great school, it's fine. So I went, and tuition was pretty expensive those days. It was $500 a semester, which was considered very, very expensive. The first semester, my brother Reddy, after he finished his internship and was in practice already in 1941, he was just in practice, he had $1,000 saved up, and he said he would give it to me to get started in my first year in dental school. So when I was in dental school, they were sending me $11 a week, and I got by on $11 a week. But after about I was out there about 6 months, I figured I was able to put in some working hours while I was going to dental school and still be able to study. So I got a job while I was out there, and I was making a little more than $11 a week. And I kept that job until the second semester of my junior year.
Is that when you worked for the ice cream people?
I had several jobs. For a time, I worked for Railway Express on the platform. In other words, the Railway Express used to bring in, they had a big platform with a conveyor belt. And there was one man, these big trucks would bring in the packages to go onto the freight cars. On one side of this platform was freight cars, on one side was the trucks that brought it in. And all we used to take the packages from the conveyor belt and put from the truck, put it on the conveyor belt, and there was a fellow who would know where the address, what freight car that would be assigned to, and put a number on it, and then take it from that and put it into the freight cars, and pack it in the cars. And they were paying me a lot of money. They were paying me $1 an hour, and if you worked on overtime on Saturdays and Sundays, which is considered time and a half, it was $1.50 an hour. So up until the time the Army took over, I worked for Railway Express. Before I worked for Railway Express, I got a job. We were renting an apartment on a street called Melwood Street, which was practically within walking distance of the school. And one of the fellows worked for Tech Ice Cream, which was originally Tech Beer, but during Depression years they became an ice cream company. Not during Prohibition.
Prohibition, yeah.
They became an ice cream company. And in fact, their slogan was when they went back to making beer, they said, "Tech smiles back at you." That was their slogan. Because but they were also they still maintained their ice cream company. So my job was that after everybody left, I used to go there and wash the big tanks and hose them all down with hot water. So one time I worked at night with another man who was a regular. It was hard to find labor there. Everybody was going off to war. This was 1942. And I worked there, and then I slipped on the step, and I hurt my back. And I said to myself, "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to. I don't want to practice dentistry. I don't want to have problems with the back the rest of my life." So I left the job, and then I went to work for Railway Express. Then what happened was, in the second semester of my junior year, since they needed dentists, because we were mobilizing, we were already getting involved in the war. Fact of the matter is, I remember as if it was yesterday when we bombed Pearl Harbor, and I walked up to dental school. The clinic was down on one level, and up on the hill was the 2-year technique school, where you learned with the mannequin, and before you got down to the junior year was the clinical years. And I remember talking about we were getting into war, and I didn't have a radio. One of the fellows that lived with close by school, we went down there during lunch hour, and we listened to the president make this famous speech that they had lived in infamy. Pearl Harbor was bombed. The Congress declared war, and immediately, when I was admitted to dental school in 1941, I got a notice from my draft board that I was eligible to be drafted, and my number was coming up. But once I got admitted to dental school, they immediately gave me a deferment. Anyway, what I started to say, after the junior year, after I finished the first semester of my junior year, and we had an accelerated program where you only got off. The only time you got off was during Christmas week. There was no summer vacation. You went to school all year because it became a 3-year course instead of a 4-year course. Because they needed dentists, and we were being deferred. So then I was living high in the high. They were paying me per diem, which means they paid you. Paid you a salary, plus living quarters, plus other expenses, plus uniform, plus everything. So I was getting approximately $140 a month.
Wow.
It cost me $30 a month. I shared an apartment, a 3-bedroom apartment, first with in the same building with a fellow named Mark Spellbaum, and then Marvin Locker. And I was really in great shape. We never had so much money. And then, of course, but since the Army took over, and before the Army took over, they wanted to be sure we'd stay in dental school. They gave us, the first semester of my junior year, they granted all students $500 loans from the government, not payable when
You finished.
you finish your school, if you went into the Army when you finished your service. 4% interest. So of course I took that money, of course, and I paid for my first semester. And then in the second semester, they sent me down to Camp Cumberland, Pennsylvania, for 10 days. And they gave us uniforms, made us PFCs, gave us a patch, which was the ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, and the picture in there someplace in the uniform. Anyhow, and when you graduated, naturally, you had to go into the service. You graduated in uniform as first lieutenants. So after that, and then when we graduated, we had to report to Camp Carlisle, which was a 6-week Army Medical Field Service school, where they taught you all about being a soldier, going through an infiltration course and everything else. And even though you had an identification where you were Red Cross, that you didn't carry a gun, that you were a member of the medical corps, and so on and so forth, that you captured. Anyway, we graduated in 1944, in June 1944, May 31st, 1944, as first lieutenants. And we had a short time before we had to report to Carlisle Barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Gettysburg. You know Carlisle, Pennsylvania? And that was also a officers training school. They trained second lieutenants, OCS. So I was there for 6 weeks, and then my first assignment was Camp Barkley. That was known as they didn't know what, they had a lot of dentists, but they didn't know what to do with it, because they were actually loaded with dentists, but they didn't have enough units to some of the fellows that were at Barkley lived in wooden shacks, literally wooden shacks. It was a terrible camp. Anyhow, I was there for 3 months, and most of the men who were dentists were acting as field officers, going on marches and all the rest of that stuff. Similar to the type of thing we had to do when we were at Carlisle Barracks for 6 weeks. We had to go on forced hikes and bivouacs and everything else. So to get an idea of what it would be if you got into a field hospital or a hospital, an evacuation hospital, like the picture MASH, the series. Anyhow, after that, Barkley, since I said I was on limited service, and I couldn't do any, because of the fact that I had an incisional hernia, I told him that I had to sign a waiver to get into the service altogether. I could have gotten out, but I signed a waiver to stay in. Anyhow, they put me in the clinic at Barkley. I worked in the clinic. And from Barkley, they sent me to it was a real luxury type of situation. They sent me to Asheville, North Carolina, which was an R&R, rest and rehabilitation This was in 1940. It was in 44, and they took over and they had all these fancy hotels there, and they took them over. The Grove Park Inn, which was a very, very famous hotel, that was became an officers club, and the food and everything else was just really marvelous. Anyhow, they paid us to live in. There was no post. We didn't stay at the hotels, but we rented apartments around close by the clinic. The hotels were taken over for the men who would come back from Panama or from the South Pacific. Some had been wounded and already been rehabilitated, but weren't going back into the service. Anyway, they were there for about a month. While they were there, they established a clinic. They took over a loft above a big furniture store, and they put up a clinic, about a 12-unit clinic. And since I was really living a high life there, I got into trouble in the sense that I was goofing off a lot. I wasn't producing as much as I should. They expected you to turn do X number of fillings a day and X number. And it was a sort of a peachy job, you know. Every night I was partying. When I came into the clinic, I was a little groggy. So the colonel gave me a major. It was a major in charge. A major. Anyhow, the major gave me a lousy rating, and it shipped me out to Fort McClellan, Alabama. And Fort McClellan, Alabama, I got there in February 1945. And I stayed there until 1946. I was practically permanent cavalry there. And of course, in 1946, my mother came to Fort McClellan, Alabama. You know why she came there? Because after she had finished her internship and her residency and everything, all her training from Columbia, she had been in Lawson and right side in Atlanta, and she'd been in Kennedy and Memphis. They were all one was a psychiatric hospital, one was an amputee hospital, and she got all her basic training. And her first permanent assignment was at Fort McClellan, Alabama. They lived in nurses' quarters, but they were civilian